It is time for us to work on the centerpiece of this design. And by centerpiece, I mean the literal center, the lettering. And I love adding lettering and writing and quotes to my designs. And I know a lot of people always wonder, what stitch to use for lettering because there are a couple of considerations to keep in mind. And there are lots of different stitches that work great for lettering. One of my favorite stitches is chain stitching, or the chain stitch, which is what this is right through here. And it's a nice little tiny chain stitch is great for nice smooth curves, and it has a nice texture to it. You could do a split back stitch. You could do a whipped back stitch, just a plain back stitch. Anything that makes a good line. You just have to sort of keep in mind what width, what weight of line you want. And another really good stitch for lettering is couching. You can see up here I've done a little bit already. And I know that we already did couching over on the Jingle Bells, but that was with six stranded DMC thread. So a very, a much smaller line. And I wanted a thicker line for the lettering on this design, but I also wanted to use my favorite yarn. If you have done some of my other stitch alongs with me, you already know that I love this yarn. When I saw this hot pink color in the store a couple of years ago, I just bought it and I thought I'm just going to do something with that. And now I think this is at least the third design that I've done something with, and sometimes in different ways. But the color is so pretty, has a little bit of a sheen to it, but it also is an excellent weight. It has a nice thick weight to it for this lettering. But there are a couple of considerations to keep in mind when you are couching with this yarn. So let me go over those. If you think back to when we did the couching on the Jingle Bells with the stranded DMC, we had a surface thread and a couching thread. And so this yarn is going to serve as our surface thread. And when we did the couching before, the surface thread, I put it on one needle and I pulled a long length of that thread through the fabric and then laid it on top. Well, one of the things about this yarn, as much as I love it, is that it gets fuzzy. If you rub it a bunch or untwist it or pull it through the fabric a lot, like if I were to pull a long length of this yarn through the fabric, that whole length of yarn would get fuzzy on here because you had, pulled it through this tight weave of the fabric. And I don't want fuzzy letters. So there are a couple of things, well, there's one main thing that I do to keep it from getting fuzzy. And let me show you what that is. Before I get into a lot of detail about how to keep the yarn from getting fuzzy, let's talk about how much yarn you're going to need. And what I try to do is to figure out sections of this lettering where I'm going to start and stop. You could, like the word all, you could do the entire word from beginning to end, starting here and going all the way to this last point. But sometimes sometimes there are natural spots where you would stop and start, obviously, like the J. Let me move this down. Like the J obviously is a single thing, the I is a single, stretch. The N, I started here and I stopped right here, and then I started again at the top of the G. So the jingle is a little more complicated. But for the word all, I think I'm going to, let me get a needle out. I think I'm going to obviously start right here. I always think kind of like as if I'm writing it with a pen. I'm going to start here, come around, go to here, and I'm going to have a stopping point right here where I'm going to go down with my thread. And then I'm going to knot it on the back, and then I'm going to start again right here and keep going. So what I want to do is figure out how much yarn will I need for that little section. I take my yarn, I give myself about, I don't know what that is, 4 inches, 4 or 5 inches, and then I just kind of lay it on the letters as far as I want to go. And I know I'm going to stop right there and then I give myself another about 4 inches. So that is the length of thread that I am going to be using for this section. So I snip that off. So, sorry, I keep saying thread, I mean yarn. So there's the length of yarn that I'm going to use for that section. Next, let's talk about needles. And the needle I'm going to use for this yarn is a number 20 chenille needle. And that's because it's a much larger needle. The eye is larger and the shaft is larger, which means it'll make a larger hole when it goes through the fabric. And to get this yarn into the eye of this needle, there's two methods. You can take the end of the yarn and squeeze it with these fingers, and then you take that eye and as you're squeezing your fingers together, you can press it down, and sometimes it works. Okay, see that actually didn't work great. I caught a little bit of yarn right there. See that? So, I mean, that works, but I don't use that method because of sometimes it fails, and I don't want to fail. I want it to be right the first time. So I am going to use my favorite needle threader right here. It's this one. It has this flattened wire right here, which is pretty sturdy. And the way you use a needle threader is to put it through the eye of your needle. Get the end of your yarn or thread, put it through there. I'm going to just go a little ways, and then I'm very carefully going to, I pinch the wire part. I don't hold it back here and pull and yank. I hold it up here, so I'm kind to my needle threader, even though this one's pretty sturdy, and you pull it through. The eye of that needle is large enough that even this thick yarn just goes right through. But I'm not going to pull very far, right? I have just a very short tail right here. I am not going to add a knot on the end because this is not going to be, I'm not going to pull this yarn all the way through to this end. This is the part where I'm trying to avoid pulling the whole length of yarn through the fabric because that makes it fuzzy. What I'm going to do is this end is going to be the part that goes to the back. So I'm just going to barely pull a little bit, like not even very much at all. All right? And then I'm going to go down where I'm going to start and gently pull through just a little bit. I did not pull much at all. All right, let me flip the hoop over and I'll show you what I'm going to do on the back. Here we are on the back, and you can tell I did not pull very much yarn through. I don't want to pull 6 or 8 inches. I want to keep as little yarn on the back as possible. I'm going to take it off of the needle, and now I'm going to tie a little knot right in the end of the yarn like that. And now I will gently pull this from the front so that knot is up against the fabric. So see, I've only pulled about that much yarn through the fabric this whole time. So now I haven't agitated that yarn a whole lot. Now let me flip the hoop back over. Here we are back on the front again, and now we have our yarn ready to couch just like we did when we were using just the plain old DMC 6-stranded thread. So that's our surface thread yarn. For the couching thread, I am using 2 strands of the red DMC. So that's a nice little contrast between the yarn. You can get a lot of neat effects with couching and yarn if you use, like a bright color for the yarn and then a really contrasty color for the couching thread, like a bright yellow or something. That's a neat effect. I didn't want it to be quite so stripy as that, so I'm using the red, which is, I don't know, this season pink and red is one of my favorite combinations. But here I am ready to start couching just like I did before. So now I'm going to hold it with this hand and do my couching stitches. I want these little curves to be nice and smooth. So as before, I'm putting these couching stitches fairly close together on these curves so that it's not like jagged lines. It's a nice smooth curve. Making sure I don't have loose sections of the yarn in between those couching stitches. This is one of those corners that we talked about before on the bell. So I'm going to make sure I put a couching stitch right there. And I will hold it tight. Alright, I'm holding that tight from the back, and now I can change directions with this without it coming loose. So hold that couching thread tight, bring this over, and make my next couching stitch. Alright, this yarn doesn't like to make quite as tight of a point as, say, thread does, but I forgive it. I love it so much. So I will quickly couch this length of yarn that I've cut off. And once again, it doesn't matter if I couch from the, outside to the inside, right to left, or if I go inside to outside, left to right. It doesn't matter. Doesn't make a difference. So here we have now come up on the point where I decided I wanted to stop and start over. So I think that's the last couching stitch I need to make for that area, that line. So now it's time for me to come back, put the end of this yarn back on my big needle, my number 20 needle. I will do that again. So this is why you can see I gave myself some extra yarn when I was deciding how much length to cut off. I mean, I have quite a bit of extra here. I really overestimated, I guess. But so now this whole length of yarn I can now put down through the fabric because we're really just going to knot it and then trim it off. So I'm going to make sure everything's in its place. Now I will flip it over and show you that now. On the back again now, here's the thread that's coming out. Here I've still got it on my needle. What I'm going to do is put a knot in it just like I would do if I was working with a regular embroidery thread. So there's my knot up against the back of the fabric. And I am going to, you could run it under those stitches nearby, but honestly, I'm just going to trim it off. And then we're done with that section. So I had some extra, here's all the extra yarn that I had. So when you're estimating how much yarn for each segment that you're working on, give yourself some extra, but don't, you don't have to give yourself a foot or 12 inches of extra every time because you're just going to waste yarn. Because now I'm just going to throw this away because I don't want to use it. Obviously it's too short, but even if I had a long piece, it's been pulled through the fabric and is now fuzzy. So also we have at the back our couching thread, the 2 strands of red, but I'm not going to knot that or cut it off or anything because I have more lettering to do. So I don't have to, I can just keep using this thread until I'm out of the red. So I'm just going to leave that alone, start over with a new segment of yarn and keep couching. For the rest of the word, all, I don't see a really good stopping point. I mean, you could stop maybe where like one of the L's comes up right here, but I think I'm just going to do the whole rest of this word. So here I am again with my yarn. Gonna give myself about 4 inches or so, and then just loosely estimate how much yarn it will take by kind of laying it on top like that. Okay, that's the end, and then I'll give myself another 4 inches, and that is how much yarn I will cut off for that segment. And now I will repeat the process. I will put this put an end on my number 20 needle, pull that little short end through starting right here, and couch the rest of this word just like I did the A. There is just one more thing I wanted to mention to you when working with this yarn. If, as you're going along, especially when you're working on a longer section, the yarn might come a little untwisted. You know, the strands will not be coiled quite as tightly. And if that happens, I just take my yarn and I just twist it again so that those twist back up. Sometimes they'll just kind of get a little bit loose, and I just like to keep it um, in a more tight twist as I am. Like I said, it can happen sometimes as you get towards the end of a long stretch. So just keep that in mind. Oh, and there's one other thing I forgot to talk to you about on the couching, and it's the little dot for the eye. And it's hard to tell, but it's really just a teeny tiny little circle of yarn that is couched. I think there's like three couching stitches of the 2 strands of red. So it's just a little bitty circle of couching. Do it just the way you did the rest of it, okay? That's all. I could have put a French knot there, but I know some of you guys don't like French knots, so I saved you from French knots on this project, okay? You're welcome. Just one more thing to do to finish up the words, and that is to stitch the word the. The. That sounds weird, doesn't it? But that's what it is. And it's super simple, just a very straightforward split back stitch using 3 strands of the red thread. And this is a time where the small curve, small stitches rule does absolutely apply. Because you can see this curve right here. I want to make sure that I have a small enough stitch that it makes a really nice curve that follows the exact line. With words, I try to be really accurate. You know, flowers, it doesn't matter if the curve is a little straighter or a little more curved, but with words, you really, especially small words, you have to be pretty accurate. So that's all to do for this. Really simple. And once you finish the, you'll be all finished with the words. We have now come to the final task to complete on this hoop, and it is to make the holly berries. And I would not be surprised if this ends up being everybody's favorite part of this hoop. And I know this in part because when we did, this was a previous stitch along, and the very last thing we did was these berries. And I don't know, there's just something fun about them. They're different, they're really 3-dimensional, obviously, and they're satiny, and it's just a really fun, interesting technique to do. So what do you need to make these berries? Well, you need a bead, first of all. And the beads that we used on that stitch along that I just showed you was a bead like this. It's called a pony bead, and it has a nice big hole, and that's important. It's plastic, comes in lots of different colors. The color doesn't really matter because we're going to be covering it up with thread. But these have kind of a almost like a barrel shape. It's not a round shape, and I really, really wanted to try to find a bead that was round for these holly berries. And so I decided to try these 8mm wooden beads, and they're working really well. Now I mentioned the hole, and the hole is very important in this. You cannot use a bead that has a really small hole. So if you find like an 8mm pearl, that has a tiny hole, it's not going to work because you're going to have to be putting thread and the needle through that hole a bunch of times and it's going to build up. So the size of the hole is important, and this hole seems to be working well. It's just big enough to get that thread, needle and thread, through there as many times as I need. Some of these wooden beads, let me see if I can show you on one of them. Sometimes they have a little bit of, wood sort of stuck in the hole right there. These are pretty good. Some are worse than others. If that's the case, you can just take a needle, or if you have just something, and you can kind of ream that hole out if it has a lot of gunk in there. But these are not too bad. So if you can find ones that aren't just filled with, rough, uncut wood on the inside, that's the best. The thread we are using is 6 strands of this DMC red thread. Now let me move these out of the way. This is all 6 strands. And remember when we were doing the couching with 6 strands and I said it was important not to strip the threads for couching? Well, here it is critical that you strip these threads because you really, really need them to be flat. When they go around this wooden bead a bunch of times, you do not need it to be twisty. You need it to be flat like a ribbon. It's really essential here. You're just not going to be able to accomplish this. First of all, you're not going to be able to get it through the hole enough times to cover the whole bead, and it's going to be all lumpy. So definitely have to strip your threads. I have cut a 20-inch piece of thread and put it on this. This is the number 24 chenille needle. You cannot use that big number 20 because it won't go through. 20 inches is what I found is just the perfect length, so you don't have to cut, 40 inches because you're just going to cut it off and waste the rest of that. But you're going to need at least 20 inches to be able to give yourself enough extra thread to go around the bead and leave yourself a tail to sew on. But I'll explain that in a minute. One other thing about the thread is that you do not need to tie a knot in it. There's no knot because we're not going to pull this through anything. I mean, you're not going to pull it to the end. So just leave it unknotted. So let's get to making our first berry. Now I'm going to try to show you. I have to hold on to this really tightly. So I'm going to try to show you as much as I can. So I'm going to hold the bead with one hand, and I'm going to put the needle through. And now I'm going to leave about 5 inches of thread here coming out of the end of the bead. All right. Now here's the beginning is in some ways the most fiddly because I have to hold on to that tail without it being yanked through the bead while I am also pulling the needle and thread through the bead. So I usually try to grasp that tail of thread with these fingers, and then I hold the bead with these fingers. Okay, so I'm keeping that. So if I pull on that tail is not going to just come right through the bead. All right, now I am going to, sorry, I'll try not to move so much so that you're not dizzy. Okay, now, and I'll get up close too. So now I'm going to come around this bead. I'm going to try to lay that ribbon of threads. That's why see how important it is that they lay side by side. I'm going to grip it with these fingers, and now I'm going to put the needle through the hole. And I'm going to make my first stitch, if you will. All right, I'm going to make sure it's really tight. And I'm going to go back and I'm going to readjust, and I'm going to get a hold of that tail again, and I'm going to hold that bead. All right, so see how those are laying flat and snug against the bead? See that? Got to make sure every single one of these stitches, or these wraps, whatever you want to call them, is all flat against the bead. So now I want to come make my second one. Now I could just come up and I could just put the needle through the bead and pull the thread. But I'm going to try to help it along here and try to get it as flat as possible. And so I'm going to put the needle down, and I seem to like try to get those threads to be super flat, and then I go ahead and I lay it next to the previous stitch, and I kind of hold on. And then what I find is helpful is to take this thumb, and so I've already put those wraps in place, still holding on to this tail a little bit, and now I'm going to put my thumb on top of those wraps. They're already kind of placed. This is the part that you can't really see because I have to cover it up with my thumb, but now I will put the needle up through the hole and pull that tight. And there's my second stitch. So now after every stitch, I'm going to make sure that they're laying flat and that all of the strands are sort of pushed next to each other. Now when I do that, I want to be careful not to push so hard that the threads get all bunched on top of each other. I still want them to lay flat. I don't want them to be crowded on top of each other. So I'm going to do that again. So I'm going to hold on to the tail, and as you keep wrapping, this tail will eventually kind of get sewn securely on the inside, and it's not really going to come loose. But every time especially here at the beginning, I do try to keep a hold of it so that those first strands right there don't get loose. So I'm going to do that again. So I'm going to hold on. I'm going to sort of flatten out those threads. I'm going to put them in place. All right, see how I've put them next to the one previous. And I'm going to hold that down with my thumb. So now I know they're not going to shift while I do this. I'm going to put the needle up through the bead and pull it tight. All right, so now they're there. They've, a little bit of space. So I'm going to very gently sort of push them next to the previous strands like that. And I'm going to keep doing that, go all the way around. And I have found that seems to be the perfect number of times to go around. Oh, I kind of lost that one, didn't I? Sorry, can't see that. That one got a little out of control. Try that again. I'm going to pull that one up. All right, I didn't hold that one with my thumb. That's okay. I'm going to pull it tight, but see how it's way far over to the right? I'm going to have to push it way up against those. That's why it helps to hold it with your thumb as you're putting the needle through the hole. All right, so I've kind of got those back in place. So I was saying, I found that it seems like the correct number of times that it takes to both fill up the space on the bead, and about the limit of the times that I can get the needle through the hole as all this thread builds up is 12 times. And of course I've lost count because I've been yammering away. I think that might be 4 or 5. Oh, we'll see. All right, so push those strands so that they're lined up. Let's just say that's 5, I guess. All right, I'm going to lay the next one up against the previous stitch, hold it with my thumb, put the needle through and pull it tight. All right, see now at this point I can have a little more control because I can sort of pull with these fingers and these fingers, and I can keep pulling on this to make sure that everything is staying tight. I'm going to lay the next one down, hold it with my thumb, pull it tight. I've totally lost count about how many that was. Maybe this is 7? I don't know. We'll see when I get more to the end when everything is full. That could be 8. This would be 9, maybe. Oops. Hold that in place. Oops, sorry. Maybe that was 10. We're going to call that one 10. We're going to call this one 11. All right, so now you might be thinking, okay, it's pretty well covered. I'm going to go through here, and I feel like it works out best if you go consecutive. You put a stitch and then a stitch next to it and a stitch next to it, that you don't like do a stitch and then go find an empty spot on the bead and do a stitch over there and then find an empty spot and do a stitch over there, because I think what that does is it kind of builds up too much. I don't know, the threads are going opposite directions as they come out of the hole, and you get, it's too crowded inside the hole. If you go, one stitch and put one right next to it, and then one right next to it, and one right next to it, that everything stays a little smoother, not just on the outside, but also on the inside of the hole. So let me do this, what I'm guessing is the 12th stitch. So I'm going to put that, see how I'm putting that one right in that space and holding it down. All right, so yeah, that was 12 stitches. But if you still have, if you kind of, shift them around a little bit, don't shift them so strongly that they, like I said, they bunch on top of each other. But you can shift them over so they're still smooth, but there's still a space. That's okay, because look what we're going to do next. We're going to have to get this thread down here at the bottom, because we can't have one thread coming out one end and one thread coming out the top. So we're going to take this thread, do the same thing again. I'm going to run my fingers so it's flat, and I'm going to lay it down so that it fills that little spot. And I'm, again, going to hold it with my thumb, but I'm also going to flip it over. So now we are on the bottom of the bead, where this is the thread that we started out with, the tail that we left. But I'm holding that, I'm covering it up with my thumb, but that little space we had, I'm taking this thread and covering that little space. See it peeking out right there? But now I want to anchor this. So I'm going to very carefully take the tip of the needle and just pick up a little bit of thread on the bottom. I don't want to take a huge chunk of thread because I don't want to disturb all of those smooth wraps that we've done so far. I just want to anchor this thread by, just pulling it through those really tight wraps. And you may have to pull pretty hard, pull it carefully, and pull it till it is smooth. And that got that's all right, it's okay. It went over just a little bit, but I'll just kind of, all right. So that is pretty well anchored. Okay, see a little space opened up, but that's all right. I can just kind of fudge and just move everything around just a hair so that everything is covered. If I move it too much, I get too much of a space. But generally that is very well covered. If you want, you can carefully take, if you feel like this one's not very secure, you can take one more little stitch to anchor that thread. So now all I have to do is take the needle off of the thread. So that gives me now 2 tails on this bead, which is good because we are going to use those 2 tails here in just a minute to attach these to the fabric. So see how much extra I had left over? That's why you don't need to cut it any more than 20, otherwise you're just wasting thread. In fact, this tail is almost, there's plenty there. All right, so 20 inches is the perfect length to cut it. There is our first little berry. Okay, we have all of our little berries made now. So what we need to do now is attach them to the fabric, obviously. What I've done here is I've taken my first berry and I have threaded one of those tails onto the number 24 needle. Doesn't really matter what needle you use here, but that's just the one I put it on. And then I am going to take that tail down through the fabric where I want my berry to be. And I'm just going to pull it all the way through. Now I'm going to take the needle off of that tail, and now I'm going to put that tail on the needle. Make sure you get all 6 of those strands through there. Okay. Okay, and then I'm going to go down right next to where that other little tail went in and pull that tail through. All right, so that's the first one. I'm going to take the needle off and I'm just going to leave it like that on the back for the moment. And now I'm going to do the same exact thing for the other 2 berries. Pull both tails through and don't knot them anything just yet. Just get all 3 berries attached to the fabric. We are on the back side now, obviously, and we have all these tails coming out. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to take one tail from one berry and a tail from the berry next to it, and I'm going to tie them together. Really just, a double knot like that. Whoops. What I do want to make sure though, I do want to make sure that it stays tight against the fabric. I don't want that knot right there to be loose, because then the berries on the front will be more wobbly. So I'm going to do my best to try to keep that knot really tight against the fabric. I don't know, you might even invite someone in to come hold it for you while you do this part, but I'm on my own today, so alright, so there's that one, and now I'm going to tie these 2 together. I'm pulling pretty tight, but I don't want to, stretch the fabric out of, I don't want to make a big pucker there. But I am trying to keep that knot up against the fabric. And now I'll do these 2. Get that dude to stay out of the way. I know you can't really see what I'm doing, but obviously just come on. Almost. Okay, so there we are. All right, I can go ahead and trim those, but before I do that, just to be safe, I am going to flip this back over and see how those berries are lined up. All right, I'm pretty pleased with how those are spaced out. I did take just a teeny bit of time when I was putting the needle down in there to make sure that they were, close enough and far enough away from each other, but I like the way those are positioned. So what I can do now is just make sure those knots on the back are tied securely, and then I could trim that. Now, I did these over here, and you can tell that they're a little, I don't know, wonky, They're not quite all snugged up together. So what I could do for that, I could probably get that knot I could undo that knot on the back and I could reposition that, which I might actually do that. But if you don't want to do that, you could also take, I was looking for a needle that had red thread on it, and then it occurred to me, well, duh, I have all these strands of thread on the back, all those tails hanging down there on the back. So what I did was can you see this? From the back, I just picked out two of the longest strands on one of those tails, and I have threaded my needle. So now I can come up, didn't even have to figure out a new thread. They were already hanging there on the back. So now what I can do is I can take, if I want this berry to go a little further that way, I am going to come up with that needle just out away from that berry just a little bit. Come up like that. Now I just want to come up on the side of the berry just a little bit, not too far up, but just enough. Like if I wanted to go this direction, I'm going to do it on this side. If you wanted this berry to go that way, you would come up on this side. But anyway, I'm going to pull this one this way. So I'm just going to run. See if you can see this. I'm just going to barely pick up just a couple of threads on that berry. Can you see that right there? Where that needle is? I'm just going to pick up a couple threads. I'm going to very gently run that needle through there. I don't want to disturb all that pretty smoothness on the berry. So now I can just put the needle down back into the fabric, and when I pull it, it will make that berry lean over in the direction that I wanted. So see how easy that was? If you need to adjust the position of a berry, just very gently run one stitch into those stitches on the berry and just pull it in the direction that you want. So now I will knot that, and I've got all those threads in the back, and I'm happy with where my berries are positioned, and so I can make sure those are all knotted enough, and then I can trim them. And then that, lovely stitchers, means that is the end. We are finished with this fun Christmas stitch along, this Christmas hoop, and I certainly hope that you have had as much fun as I have had teaching it to you. I hope you enjoyed stitching it, and I will hopefully see you for our next project that we work on together. All right, bye everyone.